Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table when she knew the mission better than anyone else in the room? Millie Johnson sat quietly in the back row, a clipboard on her lap, a pen poised with mechanical precision. The men in uniform filled the seats ahead, voices trading easy laughter and practiced confidence, like this war had already been won, and they were just waiting for the medal ceremony. She wasn't invited into that confidence. She never had been outside the dawn. Had painted the English countryside in soft gold. Inside RAF Whitmore's briefing room, the walls smelled of coffee and fatigue, and war. The kind of war that didn't make noise with bullets or bombs, but whispered through clipped voices, glanced dismissals and unspoken assumptions. She was used to it by now. Mostly Millie wore her uniform as regulation demanded, neat, pressed, and flawless. But on her chest, just below the official insignia, was something that didn't belong to her. Not technically a pair of pilot's wings. Captain David Sterling's wings, pinned quietly that morning. A private act in a public world. The base thought it a tribute, a gesture, something soft-hearted from a grieving technician. But Millie knew what it was. It was a promise, a plan, a beginning. She glanced at the screen up front, where maps flickered under the projector's hum. Operation Daybreak. The mission David Sterling died trying to complete. The mission they now feared too much to fly again. But there was something Millie hadn't told them, not yet. The morning had started earlier for her than anyone else on base. By 0400, she was already in Hangar C, wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. Staring at the Spitfire Sterling used to fly, the one she still maintained herself. The sky above was clear, the kind of perfect flying weather that made her stomach twist with longing and grief. She had spent 18 months stationed here. 18 months. Making those engines sing, balancing fuel loads, recalibrating controls, and listening. Listening to the way they talked about her, not cruelly, just casually, like she wasn't even there. She was just the aircraft systems specialist. They respected her. Some even admired her work, but they didn't see her. Not really. Not as a pilot, not as someone who might belong in the sky. Not someone who had been flying since she was 12, who knew every instrument on a Supermarine Spitfire better than the men who climbed into one every day. To them, she was competent, reliable, small, and safe. But David had seen something else. He used to ask her opinion, not pretend to, actually. Listen, he let her modify his flight plans, tweak his aircraft configurations. And once, just once, he told her that if the rules were different, he'd have her flying by his side. Then he went up alone, didn't come back. And now the mission he died for, the one they needed urgently, sat in limbo. Too dangerous, too complex, too late. They didn't know she had spent every night in the simulator perfecting that route, that she'd memorized the terrain, the weather patterns, the defensive placements, that she could fly it in her sleep and sometimes did. They didn't know she wasn't asking permission. She was waiting for the moment. And the moment was coming. In the briefing room, Major Harrison cleared his throat. Operation Daybreak remains postponed pending further review of enemy positions and pilot assignments. His voice, clipped and precise, lacked urgency, lacked the weight it should have carried. Millie stared at the map. She knew that delay meant death. Allied troops were moving based on incomplete intel. Every day they waited meant higher chances of walking blind in the enemy fire. Then she saw it, a detail on the map faint, overlooked. Sterling had mentioned it once in a late-night planning session. A river valley, a terrain mask, a way in. She raised her hand. It felt like her arm weighed 50 pounds. "Sir, I believe there's an alternative approach route," she said, her voice cutting through the room's murmur. Heads turned. Silence fell like fog. "Miss Johnson," Major Harrison replied with polite surprise, "this is a tactical flight discussion. Your input is noted. I helped Captain Sterling design the original plan." She pressed, standing now, the weight of the wings on her chest burning like fire. We discussed a secondary route through the valley systems near Sector 7. Lower altitude, less radar exposure, reduced. Anti-aircraft risk. There was silence, then snickering. Then one pilot Webb asked, "And who would fly that?" "It's suicide without top-tier low-altitude experience." "I would," she said. Without blinking, the room laughed, except Harrison. He studied her, and for a moment, just a flicker, he looked like a man who didn't know what to do with what he saw. She walked out of the room in silence. No one followed. Outside, the wind had picked up. RAF Whitmore bustled in its usual rhythm. Jets refueled, pilots smoked in clusters, mechanics barked orders. No one noticed her. She moved through them, like she always had, quiet, invisible, essential. Inside her coat pocket was a checklist for the aircraft Sterling used. His backup Spitfire. It hadn't flown since he died, but it had been maintained by her, meticulously, religiously. It wasn't just airworthy, it was perfect. And it wasn't just grief she carried, it was readiness. She stood at the hangar door, but she wasn't looking at the aircraft. She was looking at her own reflection in the glass and deciding who she really was. The hangar was quiet at night, quieter than the barracks, quieter than the mess hall, quieter even than the empty simulator room where Millie had spent hundreds of hours convincing a machine she belonged in the sky. The Spitfire stood before her, sleek, polished, patient, Sterling's aircraft, still marked with his initials. The aircraft was technically grounded, awaiting a final inspection, but she'd already completed it twice. Everything worked. Everything was ready, including her. She placed one hand against the fuselage, her fingers resting over the painted name. On the side, Falcon 77. They called him Falcon Leader, but tonight, the aircraft didn't belong to him. Not anymore. It belonged to her. Millie Johnson, 5'4", soft-spoken, maintenance girl with grease-stained hands and a mind sharper than any blade. But no rank, no recognition, no authority. Still, inside this hangar, there was no doubt. Not in her posture, not in her eyes, and certainly not in her voice when she whispered, "I'm going to finish what you started, David." The decision had already been made hours ago, though it hadn't reached her lips until just now. She wouldn't ask again. She would fly. No one suspected her during her walk back to quarters. She moved with a clipboard and the usual clipped pace of someone deep in inspection protocols. She even made notes as she walked, just in case someone looked closely. They didn't. That was the secret to being invisible. Stay reliable long enough, and people stopped watching. Back in her room, Millie opened the drawer beneath her bunk and removed the item she'd kept hidden for over a year. A hand-stitched flight glove, too small for standard issue. A folded map, weathered at the edges, showing the valley route she and Sterling had sketched together. And a small metal case containing her personal navigation tools, compass, and Sterling's final mission. Notes. She laid everything on her bunk, neatly, deliberately, one by one. Then she looked in the mirror. No flight suit, no wings, except the ones pinned under protest. Just a woman who had been told, over and over again, to stay in her place. A woman who had been taught that being capable wasn't the same as being allowed. She opened the drawer again. At the bottom was a sealed envelope with her sister's name on it. The letter she'd written months ago. Just in case, she left it on the desk, beside her maintenance logbook. If she didn't return, someone would find it, read it, understand why, if back in the hangar, the mission had already begun. Her flight checklist was committed to memory, fuel, optimal, oxygen, calibrated, camera equipment, operational, engine temperature, stable. She moved with the fluid grace of someone born for this, not just trained. The base buzzed in the distance. Radios crackled. Patrols returned from routine runs, and no one noticed the small figure climbing into the cockpit of a Spitfire that wasn't supposed to fly tonight. She powered it up. The engine roared awake, and still no one stopped her as she taxied toward the runway. Millie kept her breathing steady. This wasn't fear. This was focus. The kind that lives somewhere deep in the chest, behind instinct and muscle memory. She reached the threshold and paused, engine purring, the nose of the aircraft facing the vast darkness beyond. Permission is never coming, she whispered. Then she accelerated, lifted, flew. At first, it felt like freedom. The sky wide and quiet, the ground shrinking behind her. Her hands knew the controls better than any simulator ever had. Every bump of wind, every subtle drift was met with precision. But the deeper she flew into occupied territory, the tighter the air became. Below, the valley stretched out dark. Rivers of danger threading through enemy terrain. Somewhere in those shadows, flak guns waited, fighters, searchlights, death. Her altitude dropped to 200 feet. Radar silence, radio silence. Only the soft sound of wind over wings and the click of her timer marking each turn. Then came the first searchlight. It snapped to life like a blade, cutting through the dark, reaching. Then another. Then two more. Millie banked hard left, slipped under their beams, and clung to the terrain like a shadow. Her heart pounded, but her mind stayed quiet. She could see Sterling beside her, not in a ghostly way, in a muscle memory kind of way. His voice, reminding her of the trick near Junction 7. His laugh when she'd outmaneuvered the simulator's impossible storm drill. You were always meant to fly, Millie. The first reconnaissance target loomed. A railway hub, ammunition crates, troop transports, tank lines stretching like veins across the dirt. She angled the camera, triggered the shot, then banked right too soon. Flak exploded behind her. A second burst closer. She gritted her teeth, pushed the stick down, and hugged the terrain again. A river valley curved ahead, just as the map said it would. She dipped into it like an arrow into a sheath, letting the walls absorb the enemy's searchlights. Photography complete. Objective 1. Success. But she couldn't stop, not yet. Over the radio crackling interference. Unauthorized departure. From Hangar C, aircraft ID November 77. Repeat. November 77 is airborne without clearance. Then came the order. Return to base immediately. Acknowledge this transmission. Millie reached for the switch and turned it off. Silence again. The mission was hers now. There was no turning back. Behind her, they would be scrambling, confused, angry, panicked. Ahead, 2 more objectives. 3, if you counted survival. What do you do when your own side is chasing you, and the enemy doesn't even know you're coming? Millie dropped altitude again, barely 50 feet above the jagged valley floor. The Spitfire cut through the darkness like a whisper too fast to be a shadow, too low to be on radar. Every second forward was a second deeper into enemy territory. She had 20 minutes until the second objective, a German airfield. Intelligence had labeled it low priority, but Sterling's notes told a different story. Hidden bunkers, refueling stations, aircraft painted in false insignias. It wasn't just a patrol hub, it was a launch site. Likely for tomorrow's offensive, she adjusted her course 5 degrees east. The trees outside blurred like streaks of charcoal, and somewhere in the black sky behind her, she imagined radar pings and commanders yelling into headsets. Where the hell is she going? Millie didn't need to ask that. She knew. She was flying straight into hell and bringing a camera with her. The lights came on just as she feared they would. Runway lights, dozens of them. A German night crew scrambling, not because they saw her, but because they were preparing for something else. An operation? A dispatch? A strike? Whatever it was, she didn't have time to guess. She swooped in low. 1 pass, 1 chance. The camera clicked. A burst every half second, refueling tanks, munitions wagons, dozens of fighters lined up like teeth on steel. Neshouts. Below, searchlights rose. One found her wingtip, then her tail, and then they all locked on. The first flak burst came from the eastern perimeter. Millie rolled left, then dove, She knew this pattern. Sterling had flown through it before. It was designed to herd intruders toward the open field where anti-aircraft gunners could finish the job. She didn't fall for it. Instead, she banked into a tight spiral down and left so tight the wings screamed and the G-forces blurred her vision. Her body protested, but the Spitfire obeyed. She disappeared behind a cluster of barracks just as the second round of fire tore through. The air she had just occupied. No damage. Barely. She burst out of the maneuver already planning her exit. Straight shot west. No interceptors would be waiting south. No cover. Too exposed. She took the third option. The insane one. She dropped altitude again and flew through a maintenance corridor barely wide enough to count as a path. Her wingtip clipped a tree branch. Sparks, but she held steady, used the terrain like a cloak, found the tributary Sterling had mentioned. By the time the German crews realized where she'd gone, she was gone. Behind her, the sky lit up with delayed fury. But ahead, silence again. Just the stars and her breath and the hum of the Spitfire that never once betrayed her. Then her fuel gauge blinked, a reminder. Combat maneuvering had drained more than expected. She still had the third target to reach artillery. Positions northwest of Kassel. If she missed it, the entire mission would be incomplete. But going meant risking running out of fuel before she could reach friendly skies again. Logic said, turn back. Her hand said otherwise. So did Sterling's voice in her memory. If you ever get the shot, Millie, take it. She pushed forward. The terrain shifted. Hills turned to ridges, trees to trenches. She was flying over prepared territory now. Everything below had the scent of war on it. Bunkers, communication trucks, fuel depots camouflaged under netting. Then her final target, the forward artillery line. It looked endless. Gun placements marked in dirt. Rows of trucks, shell crates, mobile. Batteries being moved into position under camouflage tarps. If they weren't stopped tonight, thousands of Allied troops would be walking into a slaughter tomorrow. Millie lined up the Spitfire, activated the camera one last time, and flew the straightest path she'd flown all night right through the heart of German firepower. The sky exploded around her, flak in every direction. Not searching now, firing. They knew what she was after. She was too low to be mistaken for anything else. Shrapnel tore past the wings. A round exploded beneath her, lifting the aircraft momentarily like a punch under the ribs. The oxygen mask rattled. Her teeth clenched, but the photos kept snapping. Perfect. Exposures every frame a priceless window into German war plans. Then one hit landed close, too close. The left wing jolted. Not destroyed, but wounded. She could feel the tremble in the control stick. Subtle but real. Time to go. She banked hard, smoke in her wake, but altitude steady. The flak crews kept firing, even as she disappeared into the valleys again. There, fury trailing her like ghosts. No one chased. Not yet, but they would. She was 20 minutes from the edge of friendly radar when she saw the first Messerschmitt, then 2 more. They dropped from altitude fast. Deadly, precise. This was the part she couldn't simulate. The part everyone said she'd never survive. The real fight, 3 fighters against 1. Against her. The voice of Flight Lieutenant Morrison echoed in her mind. She's too cautious. Not enough instinct. They'd been wrong. She wasn't cautious. She was calculated. And now she was cornered. The first dive came in from above. She didn't climb. She dropped. Let gravity pull her into the valley below, where trees broke radar and cliffs denied angles. The second fighter followed. She twisted hard right, using the terrain like a knife. The Messerschmitt clipped a branch, lost altitude. She gained distance. The third came from the front, head-on, a death challenge. But she didn't blink. She aimed for the narrow opening between 2 ancient towers of stone-ruined castle walls on a ridge. Straight through, the fighter hesitated. She didn't. He pulled up too late. Collision with the cliff. Gone. But the chase wasn't over. Fuel low. Hull damaged. 2 fighters still behind her, and no help in sight until she saw it. British radar towers in the distance. One more climb, one more maneuver. Then she was home. The final climb pushed the aircraft past limits. The engine coughed. Oil temp spiked. But Millie coaxed it, whispered to it, like she had on a dozen maintenance. Nice. Come on, love. Just a little further. The Spitfire surged up. British radio lit up. Unidentified aircraft. This is Coastal Command. Identify yourself. She pressed the switch. November 7-7. Mission complete. Request priority. Landing. Silence, then. Copy November 7-7. You're cleared for immediate return. All personnel standing by. Below her, RAF Whitmore blinked awake. Above her, the sky felt bigger than ever. And behind her, the mission was complete. The only question now was whether she'd be celebrated or arrested. She touched down like a ghost, but when the canopy opened, every eye on base was already waiting. RAF Whitmore wasn't supposed to be awake at this hour, but floodlights lit the tarmac like it was midday. Officers stood shoulder to shoulder, with ground crew, pilots, mechanics, intelligence analysts, every rank, every branch, all facing the same runway, waiting, watching. Sterling's Spitfire, her Spitfire now descended through the final stretch of black sky like a bird limping home after the longest flight of its life. The landing gear kissed the runway. Wheels screeched. The aircraft rolled to a slow stop. Smoke trailing faintly behind her wing. Then silence. No one moved for a full 5 seconds. It felt like even the wind held its breath. Then Millie unlatched the canopy and stood. She climbed down from the cockpit with the same calm she'd shown while flying between flak bursts and searchlights. Her boots hit the tarmac, and the sudden gravity of it all sank into her bones. No one applauded. Not yet. They didn't know what this was. Was it heroism or treason? Was she returning from a mission or from a crime? She looked up at the crowd, at Webb, at Morrison, at Major Harrison. Even the intelligence officers had come down from the tower. No one spoke. Then Harrison stepped forward. Flight Officer Johnson. His voice faltered for just a moment. Correction, Miss Johnson. You are under temporary detention, pending formal debrief. Millie nodded. She didn't resist, didn't argue. She handed over her flight log, then the canisters of reconnaissance. Film, then, finally, her helmet. As if surrendering proof that this night had really happened, the debriefing room felt colder than it ever had before. The walls buzzed with the low hum of projectors and radio intercepts. Her photos, were already developed and spread. Across 3 long tables, German artillery, tank lines, airfields, tactical grids. Positions Allied command hadn't even known existed. Colonel Richards was there. So was Major Harrison. 2 intelligence officers she didn't recognize, and every squadron pilot still on base. Millie sat at the center of it all. No uniformed. Defense, no advocate, just her and the truth. Let's begin with the obvious. Colonel Richards said, his voice tight. You stole a military aircraft. You violated direct orders. You flew unauthorized into enemy territory. Millie nodded. Once. Yes, sir. You understand the penalties for that? Yes, sir. He leaned forward. Then explain yourself. She took a breath, looked down at her hands, still trembling, grease under the nails. The kind of hands that fixed things, not broke them. I didn't do it to defy command. She said quietly, I did it because the mission couldn't wait, and no one else was going. That's not your decision to make, Major Harrison snapped. This is a military operation. Chain of command is not optional. With respect, sir, Millie said, locking eyes with him. Neither is survival, one of the intelligence officers stoned. She thought cleared his throat and stepped forward. He held one of her photographs. A black and white shot of the German artillery line. These are extraordinary, he said. We had no intel on these positions. We assumed their guns were still days from readiness. According to this, they're ready to fire by dawn. He placed the photo beside another. This just changed everything. Lives, another officer added. Thousands of them. Stone turned to Richards. This intelligence, unofficial or not, just allowed us to reposition key divisions along the southern front. Without it, we would have walked blind into a trap. Major Harrison didn't speak. Webb did. She got in and out under fire, he said slowly, as if the words were still hard to believe. Those valleys, I couldn't have flown them in daylight, and she did it at night, with fighters chasing her. I studied for 18 months, Millie said, her voice soft but firm. Every night, I trained in the simulator, built the route, modified the aircraft. I prepared, and when no one else would go, I did. Another silence, but this one didn't feel cold. It felt uncertain, as if the walls themselves didn't know what to do with her. Then Morrison, of all people, spoke. I told my crew she was too careful, he said, too cautious, that she'd second-guess herself to death. He looked directly at her. I was wrong. The debriefing went on for hours. Tactical questions, flight calculations, fuel usage, camera performance. They drilled her, trying to find a crack in her story, a weakness in her plan, a mistake that could justify the rules she'd broken, but there weren't any. Everything was calculated. Everything was intentional, and everything had worked at 5:47. Colonel Richards stood. This, he said, holding one of the reconnaissance photos, will save lives. Then he turned to her. Your actions tonight were insubordinate, reckless, and completely unauthorized. Millie braced for it. However, he continued, they were also executed with a level of precision, courage, and skill that exceeds the operational standards of many of our most decorated pilots. He exhaled slowly. I'm not here to decide your punishment. That decision will come from Allied command. Then he stepped closer, but if it were up to me, I'd be putting you in the sky tomorrow. Millie was dismissed, not arrested, not escorted. Just dismissed. She walked out of the room with nothing but a nod and her thoughts. Outside, the sky was bleeding towards sunrise. Light crawled over the hangars and barracks, like it didn't know what kind of night had just passed. She passed a group of mechanics. They stopped talking. Then one of them, Jamie, the quiet one, who always brought her spare parts without asking, stepped forward and saluted. The others followed, no words, just the sound of respect finally spoken. She didn't go back to her bunk. She went to the hangar, to Falcon 77. Her aircraft now, its paint chipped, its hull scorched, but still standing, just like her. She placed a hand on the fuselage, then removed the pilot's wings from her chest. She looked at them for a long time, not as tribute, not as memory, but as proof. She'd done it. She'd worn a fallen pilot's wings and led his final mission to victory. Why was she still waiting for the punishment, when the only thing that came was a knock at her door? 3 days passed. No court-martial, no ceremony either. Just silence. Millie spent those days in limbo, between celebration and condemnation. The base didn't know what to do with her, and maybe command didn't either. The pilots avoided eye contact at first. Not out of cruelty, out of shame. They had all dismissed her. And now she'd returned from a mission most of them would have refused. A mission she wasn't even allowed to try. The ground crew? They looked at her differently now. Not like one of them, not like a pilot either. Something else, something between. She still wore her maintenance coveralls, still logged engine hours, still ran diagnostics, but nobody told her to anymore. They just watched, waited, wondered. Then came the knock. She opened the door to find Major Harrison standing there with a sealed envelope in hand and an unreadable expression on his face. Miss Johnson, he said, you're to report to Briefing Room A at 0600 hours tomorrow. Millie blinked. Am I being reassigned? He didn't answer directly, but as he handed her the envelope, He said something no one else had said yet. "Thank you." Then he turned and left. The envelope wasn't heavy, but it felt like it weighed her entire future. Inside, a summons from Allied Command, a review of her actions, a list of observers, intelligence, high-ranking officers, legal staff, and one line that froze her breath. Mission intelligence to be reviewed for direct impact on European theater strategic defense. They weren't just reviewing her insubordination. They were reviewing her success. That night, she didn't sleep. She walked the flight line instead, boots scuffing softly against concrete, the wind nipping at her collar. Falcon 77 was there, resting, but her eyes weren't on the aircraft. They were on the stars above it. Somewhere out there, thousands of troops were repositioning based on her photographs. Commanders drawing lines she helped define. Lives depending on choices she made in silence. She'd risked everything, and now they'd decide whether to hang her for it. The next morning, the room wasn't just full. It was electric. Colonel Richards sat at the head of the table, flanked by Major Harrison and 2 intelligence officers. The projector was lit. Photos already queued. Pilots filled the rear seats. Webb, Parker, even Morrison. This wasn't just a debrief. "This was a reckoning, Miss Johnson," Richards began. "We've reviewed your full flight log, the reconnaissance materials you captured, and your simulator records dating back 18 months. Millie sat perfectly still. "We've also confirmed that your unofficial training included over 400 hours of night flight simulation, dozens of terrain masking runs, and customized low-altitude route plans based on classified intelligence." He leaned back slightly. "Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir," she said calmly. Stone, the intelligence officer, interjected. "You also modified Captain Sterling's backup aircraft personally, including its navigation systems and control surfaces." "Yes, sir. Why?" Millie looked directly at him. "Because I knew someone would need to finish what he started. I hoped it would be him, but I was preparing for the day it wouldn't be." Another silence. Then Richards clicked the projector. Images filled the screen. Her images, artillery nests, fuel convoys, rail links, maps annotated with movement patterns. The room held its breath as the photos scrolled through. Then Stone turned toward the table. Miss Johnson's intel revealed 3 full battalions preparing to strike at Sector 9. Had we not received this data in time, Allied forces would have been encircled within 48 hours. He turned off the projector. "Instead, we fortified, we reinforced, we dug in." He paused, and we held the line. Colonel Richards looked down at his folder, then closed it. "Effective immediately, Miss Johnson. You are to be promoted to flight officer with reconnaissance specialization." Gasps. A few murmurs, but no objections, not this time. "You will also oversee simulator-based tactical training for all RAF personnel assigned to forward recon. Your methods, though unofficial, are being formally reviewed for integration into Allied pilot prep protocols." Webb straightened in his chair. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "You've done what none of us expected," Richards said finally. "You've proven that preparation matters more than preconception." Then he added quietly, "You've also reminded this base, and perhaps the wider military, that courage doesn't always wear the rank we expect." The room stood as one. And for the first time in her career, Millie Johnson didn't feel like an outsider in uniform. She felt like a pilot, a real one. After the room emptied, Webb lingered. He approached her slowly, eyes searching for something: redemption, maybe, or forgiveness. "I misjudged you," he said simply. "We all did." Millie tilted her head. "No," she said softly. "You judged what you were taught to expect." He nodded. "I still wouldn't have flown that mission." "I know," she replied. "That's why I had to." That afternoon, the maintenance crew rolled out a new stencil for Falcon 77. It no longer read Sterling. It read FOM. General Owen pilots watched from the edge of the runway, respectful now, quiet. A few nodded. A few saluted. None laughed. And the girl who once worked quietly in the shadows of engines now stood where none of them had imagined her, at the center of the sky. Why did the silence after the promotion feel heavier than the silence before it? Millie should have felt victorious. That's what everyone kept saying. You did it, they told her. You made history. You're finally seen. But recognition, she learned, was a strange kind of weight. And the moment the applause faded, the silence that followed didn't feel like peace. It felt like pressure. Eyes followed her everywhere now, not with suspicion anymore, but with expectation. The kind of eyes that waited for her to fail, or succeed spectacularly. Nothing in between. And for the first time, she missed the invisibility, missed the quiet, missed the freedom of no one expecting her to lead. Now they did, 3 days into her new rank. Millie was pulled into a confidential briefing with Allied Tactical Command. The mission was still being planned. Nothing official. No green lights yet. But it was ambitious, high risk. She was the only pilot with the right training. The only one. With the Valley Flight Certification. The only one with first-hand eyes on enemy terrain. The plan? Fly deep into Axis-held territory to photograph a suspected mobile weapons convoy. Its existence hadn't been confirmed. But if the intelligence was right, it carried next-generation artillery that could collapse Allied supply routes in under 24 hours. She reviewed the map, traced the terrain, noticed the same blind spots Sterling used to talk about. Then she asked the question that was already forming in every mind at the table. What if the intel is wrong? Carl Richards gave a tired smile. Then you'll come home with photographs of nothing. Millie didn't smile back. I'm not worried about coming home with nothing, she said. I'm worried about not coming home. She walked back to the hangar that night alone. No escort, no spotlight. Falcon 77 stood under a single bulb, paint glinting in golden arcs. She reached out, let her fingers trace the fuselage, and whispered, You ready for another round, old girl? The aircraft didn't answer, but the wind rustling across the tarmac felt like a nod. This mission was different, not just because of the danger, because she wasn't doing it in Sterling's shadow anymore. This one was hers, and she didn't want it, not out of fear, but out of a growing truth she hadn't wanted to admit until now. She had nothing to prove anymore, and yet they still needed her. Before takeoff, she sat in the simulator room alone. The lights were off. The hum of the electronics, familiar and cold. She placed her hands on the controls and closed her eyes. Not to practice, to remember, to feel. All the nights she'd sat there alone, building the mission that changed everything. All the time she'd been ignored, dismissed, underestimated. All the time she wanted to quit and didn't. Her eyes opened, steady, sharp. She stood and walked to the flight line. The mission began under cloud cover, low altitude, no lights, no backup. Every second in enemy airspace felt like a second borrowed from a clock that didn't want to lend anymore. But she was calm, not empty, not fearless calm. She knew this air, this rhythm, this silence. It was the only place she'd ever felt fully seen, when no one could actually see her at all. Midway through the flight, turbulence hit hard. Wind patterns had shifted. Mountain drafts twisted violently. The aircraft bucked. She tightened her grip. Breath steady, heart slow. Then a glint northwest. Something moving below convoy. She dipped. Lower, risk detection. Her camera activated. 3 trucks, one larger than the rest. Reinforced, heavily guarded. That was it. She circled once, only once, snapped the angle she needed, and then pulled out. That's when the radio crackled. German frequencies, scrambled, but urgent. They'd seen her. She banked hard leftward. The ridgeline Sterling had once called the gate. Behind her, the sound of engines. Not hers. Enemy fighters, 2, no 3. Closing fast. This wasn't a chase. This was a hunt, and she was the prey. But she'd learned something in the valleys, in the storms, in the silence of being overlooked. Survival is not about aggression. It's about intention, Millie didn't fight them. She escaped them, wove through cliffs, dove through gorges, used shadows the way other pilots used missiles. She didn't need to outgun them. She just needed to outthink them, and she did. An hour later, the cliffs faded. Allied radar picked her up, unidentified. Aircraft state your code. She pressed the switch. Falcon 77, returning from blackout mission. Confirmed target sighting. Film secured. Silence. Then, copy that, Falcon 77. Welcome home. When she landed, there was no crowd this time. Just one man. Colonel Richards waiting. He didn't salute, didn't offer a handshake. He simply said, "They were right. It was the convoy. You just bought us a chance we didn't know we needed." Millie nodded. "Did we lose anyone?" He looked down. Not this time. She exhaled, then walked past him. Not in disrespect, but in relief, because for once, a mission didn't end in fire. That night, she stood at the edge of the airstrip, boots in the dirt, looking at the stars, and, for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to fly. She simply wanted to, not to prove she belonged, but because now, finally, she did. What happens when you're finally trusted only to realize the next mission might break everything you built? The celebration was quiet. Just a folder dropped onto her bunk, marked priority eyes only. No applause, no medals, no brass band playing. In the background, but the folder was heavier than it looked. Not physically, emotionally, inside. A new recon assignment. But this wasn't just intelligence gathering. It was the precursor to a strike. An Allied bombing raid was being prepped. Against a key munitions plant buried inside a civilian district. Her job? Verify the target. Confirm the location. Photograph everything. Because once the order was signed, there'd be no turning back, and the operation wouldn't just kill soldiers. It would kill everyone nearby. Millie sat on the edge of her bunk, fingers tracing the edge of the folder. She'd fought for this. Fought to fly. Fought to be trusted. Fought to be heard. And now that she was, the burden came like a weight across her shoulders. This wasn't a test of courage. It was a test of conscience. The map showed a narrow pass between two ridgelines, leading into the heart of a fortified German city. The plant was supposedly masked as a textile factory, blending into civilian infrastructure. But supply routes and movement patterns suggested otherwise. If the intel was wrong, they'd be bombing families, children, elderly. But if it was right, and she didn't confirm it in time, thousands of Allied soldiers could die when the next German offensive struck. Millie closed the folder and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Sometimes, being seen meant being asked to carry what no one else wanted to touch. Before dawn, she stood in the hangar beside Falcon 77. Jamie, the young mechanic, was already prepping her aircraft. He didn't say much, just tightened bolts, checked fluid levels, and paused only once to offer her a small nod, not of confidence, of respect. She nodded back, then climbed into the cockpit. The flight out was smooth. Too smooth, cloud cover gave her room to maneuver. Radar interference kept her off enemy scopes, but even so, she couldn't shake the feeling. This one felt wrong. Not in the mission details, in the gut, in the soul. Still, she pressed on. As she reached the target zone, the world below sharpened into haunting detail. It looked normal, like a quiet village at rest. No convoys, no smoke, no munitions crates. Just homes, schools, a bell tower, streets swept clean by mothers and storekeepers. The supposed textile factory stood in the middle, tall, rectangular, humming softly. She circled once, twice, no guards, no visible patrols. But then, a shadow, movement at the rear, a truck. Not civilian, covered, moving too quickly. Then another and another. She dipped low, camera snapping. The moment the shutter clicked, something shifted. A rooftop hatch opened. Flak. Too late to dodge. The first round missed. The second did not. It slammed into her right wing. The aircraft lurched. Smoke poured from the tail. She banked hard, diving behind a grain silo. The plant below came alive, troops pouring out, anti-aircraft batteries pivoting. Upward, Millie gritted her teeth and reached for the emergency stabilizer. The stick fought back, but she refused to let go. With half the wing torn and the engine shuddering, she broke line of sight and veered east. Every second felt like a scream. Inside the cockpit, she had the proof. The plant was military, disguised, protected, active. But now, she had to live long enough to deliver that proof. The smoke trail made her a beacon. Enemy fighters scrambled before she even crossed the ridge. 2 Messerschmitts behind her, closing fast. Her aircraft was bleeding altitude and time. She ducked. Low again, but the terrain wasn't friendly this time. Trees, power lines, hills carved with trench lines. No more lucky valleys. Just survival or not. She flipped the emergency transponder. A long shot, but Allied radar might hear it. Her breath fogged the mask. The cockpit stank of oil and smoke. Flames licked the fuselage behind her. She looked down at the film canister in her lap. Everything was in there. The truth, the evidence, the decision. If she didn't make it back, someone had to. She looked at the camera's eject panel. The safety was jammed. No parachute, no backup. No transmission. Her only option, fly it all the way in. 20 minutes to base. 15 if she risked everything. She risked everything. The Spitfire wasn't flying anymore. It was limping, coughing, falling in slow motion. But she whispered to it anyway. Just a little more, girl. Just a little more. She cleared the final ridge with less than 30 feet of altitude. Base radar pinned, sirens blared. The tower barked clearance orders. She didn't reply. She couldn't. The radio was dead. She saw the runway. Long, silver, silent. She aimed for it. Smoke trailing, fire climbing, the landing gear wouldn't deploy. She skidded in belly first. Metal screamed across concrete. The Spitfire jolted once, twice, then stopped. Silence, then flames. Then the canopy burst open. She crawled out barely in her hands. The canister. Medics rushed. Officers shouted. Fire crews swarmed the aircraft. Millie stood in the middle of it all. Legs shaking, lungs burning, but her arms stayed locked. Clutching that film like a dying soldier holds a flag. Colonel Richards pushed through the chaos. He took the canister, looked her in the eyes, and nodded. No words, just a truth passed between them. She'd done it again, and this time it nearly killed her. But as they carried her toward the medical bay, Millie whispered the one thing no one else could hear. I'm done. What happens when the war finally pauses, but your soul doesn't? Millie lay in the infirmary wrapped in white linen and quiet. Her arms bore burns. Her right side was bruised deep purple, where the cockpit slammed into her ribs. The doctors said she was lucky, that she'd landed just in time, but she didn't feel lucky. She felt tired, not just in the body, in the soul. The kind of tired that doesn't sleep away. The kind that settles in when you've been carrying something too long, too far, and finally set it down. And now, with everything still, there was no mission. Just memory. Outside, they said the war was shifting. The convoy photos had triggered a full-scale Allied operation. Bombers struck the disguised plant. 3 nights later, a weapons cache was discovered underneath, a labyrinth of tunnels packed with enough artillery to alter the course of the Eastern Front. Command had called her intel pivotal. They called her instrumental. They even offered her another medal. She refused it, not out of disrespect, but because she wasn't proud of what had happened, just certain it had to be done. Days passed. The brass wanted her back in the air, but the fire inside her had cooled to embers, and for the first time in her life, Millie said no. No to the mission. No to the uniform, no to the idea that worth only came from how close you flew to death. She had proven what she needed to. Now she wanted something else. She walked the base one last time before dawn. The wind rustled gently over hangars. Falcon 77 had been retired too damaged to fly again, but it had been left untouched, resting in Hangar C, just as it was on the night she returned. She stepped inside alone, placed her hand on the aircraft's nose one last time, and whispered, "Thank you." At the end of the tarmac, someone was waiting. Colonel Richards, hands in pockets, expression unreadable, as always. "You sure about this?" he asked. "I'm not leaving because I'm broken," Millie replied. "I know," he said. "You're leaving because you finished the mission." She nodded, then reached into her coat pocket, held something out. It was Sterling's pilot wings. She hadn't worn them since that night. They still carried the smoke and the grit and the silent promise that started everything. She placed them in Richard's hand. "They belonged to someone who believed in the impossible," she said softly. "Keep them in case someone else ever tries to." He looked down at the wings for a long time, then back up at her. "They said you were a mechanic pretending to be a pilot," he said. "But they were wrong." She tilted her head slightly. "You were a pilot, teaching the rest of us what belief looks like." Millie left the base with no ceremony, no escort, no salute, just her duffel, her coat, and a silence that finally felt clean. She didn't go far. A quiet village, not far from the sea, a place where the skies were soft and the ground steady beneath her feet. Sometimes she wrote letters to the families of those she flew for. Sometimes she fixed tractors or repaired radios. But mostly, she just lived, breathed, existed without permission, and on summer evenings, when the clouds turned pink and the wind moved like memory, she would look toward the horizon and whisper, "We made it." Years later, a young pilot training at a new Allied flight academy would find an old photo on the wall. It showed a woman standing beside a Spitfire, flight suit half-zipped, burns visible. On her arms, sit on her face. No caption, no rank, just a plaque underneath. Sometimes, dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.